What does decarbonization really mean in context of construction?
How can we reduce and ideally eliminate the amount of carbon that we emit during the process of construction? So material passports is part of the puzzle to try and unlock the circular economy for the built environment.
About collecting information, how does all of it tie to the building certifications like LEED?
That 13% of all materials that go onto a construction site go direct to waste without even being used.
Sustainable materials cost more money, there's more investment needed. Is that pre-notion correct?
Solar panels, photovoltaic cells, they were very expensive to start with. The cost of PV has dropped dramatically to the point that it is now cheaper to install PV than it is to buy gas over time.
Recent regulations that have been beneficial to push the decarbonization in construction industry.
Part Z, it's an amendment to our Buildings Act, which follows Part L. So Part L said you've got to deliver operationally sustainable buildings to a certain standard. Part Z says you've got to deliver embodied carbon sustainable buildings to a certain standard.
There's been this concept of carbon offsetting.
Anyone who is claiming to be net zero by just paying for loads of offsets is just greenwashing.
The value of the property increases 7 to 8% if you use sustainable materials. How does developers or owners try to leverage this value and try to balance it out with the immediate financial restraints versus long-term benefits?
In this episode of Constructing Tomorrow, we have Brittany Harris. Brittany is a co-founder and CEO of QFlow, a sustainability and carbon tracking company. She is a civil engineer, entrepreneur, and she also sits on the board of UK's Environment Agency. QFlow automates the collection and analysis of material and waste data on-site, enabling construction teams to make informed decisions to reduce waste, cut costs, and minimize carbon emissions. In this episode, we discuss decarbonization in construction and different ways to implement it. How does real-time carbon tracking help make informed decisions? Carbon tracking in construction workflows and its integration with building certifications. How developers can gain higher property value by selecting sustainable materials. Carbon offsetting and carbon taxes. Regulations and policy introduced to push decarbonization, and much more. With that said, I bring you Brittany.
Brittany, thanks for being here and welcome to the podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk everything there is about sustainability and decarbonization in construction. But before we dive into the specifics of QFlow and the exciting things that you guys are doing in the construction space, I want to start at ground level and talk about a few fundamental concepts. Because when we speak about sustainability, decarbonization, these terms might mean different for different people. So I think it would be benefit for our listeners if you could break down some of these key concepts. And to kick things off, what does decarbonization really mean in context of construction? And what are some of the ways in which you could implement decarbonization practices?
Sure, it is a really big topic, and what's really challenging is that it's kind of evolving all the time. So, decarbonisation at the very highest level means how can we reduce and ideally eliminate the amount of carbon that we emit during the process of construction. And that needs to come all the way from the very beginning of when we start extracting materials from the ground. So, the fuel we consume in mining or felling trees, the fuel and the energy we consume in processing those materials, whether that's cutting or sawing or refining or compiling materials, and then also the fuel consumed in transporting them to the construction site, then building with them, so the petrol and the diesel and the gasoline that we burn in our plant and our machinery, and then everything that goes through in actually the operation of that building. So decarbonizing construction is a huge, messy and complex thing, but it can be broken down to be much, much simpler. So the global standard, the guidance that people are working towards with assessing the whole life carbon of construction, and when we say whole life, that is everything from taking it out of the ground to building it to taking it back down again and eventually putting it back in the ground. The way to assess whole life carbon follows what's called the RICS whole life carbon standard. So RICS is the Royal Chartered Institute of Surveyors. And this whole life carbon standard breaks it down from A0, which is your very beginning point, through A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, through B, and it breaks it down again. And this is a really nice structure, a nice framework of thinking about all of the individual component parts during the process of coming up with an idea, building it, and then operating it and deconstructing it, so that we know what it is we actually have to measure. So it makes it much easier. It's one of the things I often say is it's how do you eat an elephant? You eat it a bite at a time. And so this framework breaks it down into nice little bite-sized chunks so that it doesn't look like this big, terrifying, complex thing that it is. It's just the tiny bits that you need to work on as you go through. Now, in terms of how do you do that? Well, it depends which bite of the elephant you're taking at that time. So if you are a material supplier or manufacturer looking at decarbonizing the products that you're selling into construction, you're thinking about how are you sourcing those materials? Can you move to electric plant? Can that plant be powered by clean energy instead of fossil fuels? If you're actually a contractor who's doing the building, it's all about where are you sourcing those materials from? Can you find them from zero or low energy sources? Can you ask those manufacturers, what carbon went into this? What is the product declaration, the environmental product declaration that comes with it? And how can you show me that that's a low carbon material? And then how are you building with it? Can you do that through electric plant? Can you work with a more local supply chain that are sourcing things more sustainably? And the list goes on depending on what piece of that elephant that you're trying to eat. And what we do at QFlow is we really focus on that construction phase. So looking at the A1 to A5 carbon bit, quantifying and identifying exactly how much carbon is going into that building bit, right from the source of the materials that you're using to the way that you're building, so that you can eat the elephant in a nice, simple, streamlined way.
Mhm. I think that was a perfect breakdown, and I like the thought process. Like it starts from the very beginning when you source it till the very end when you recycle and reuse it. So I have a stat here, and if I'm reading this correctly, the construction industry is responsible for 40% of the global carbon emission. And like to your point, a lot of the carbon emissions are also during the early phase when you're sourcing these materials, which accounts to approximately 11 to 12%. So I'm curious, what are some of the reasons why we are not able to reduce these carbon emissions?
So I think it's a misconception that we can't reduce them. We really can. But I think it's the biggest challenge for the industry is that there are so many different parties involved, and it requires a lot of moving parts to get that all to align. Now, when there are so many different stats quoted around the construction industry and decarbonisation. So the 40% of carbon emissions globally is from the built environment. Now, that includes everything from the materials we use and the way they're mined, all the way through to the operation of our buildings. If we look at just that construction phase, 11% of global emissions are just from the materials that we use and consume. And that's everything that goes from sort of the inception up to practical completion. Now, when you look at a whole life carbon of a building, so let's take a residential block. When you're trying to assess the whole life carbon of that building, about 50% of those carbon emissions happen pre-completion. So before the building is even in operation. The other 50% are in operation and in deconstruction. Now, as we start getting more and more energy efficient buildings, as we start powering our buildings from clean energy on the grid, as we start using LEDs instead of halogen light bulbs, as we start, getting more energy efficient televisions, the proportion of a building's whole life carbon that comes in operation is shrinking. So it then drops down to maybe 20%. So 80% of a building's carbon happens before it's even in operation, which is absolutely huge. So this is why the construction industry plays such a critical role, not just facilities management and building operators. It is the builders, the guys who are taking the materials out of the ground and sticking them up in these big edifices. And that's why we have such an important job in construction. Now, the reason it's hard is because the supply chain of the construction industry is vast.
Hmm.
It goes round the world multiple times. There are hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of people involved in sourcing and refining and transporting materials to the construction site. And it is not for any one person to decarbonize construction. That would be an utterly impossible task. It
Hmm.
requires all the different pieces of the puzzle to work together on this. And so it's one thing that we really try and champion in QFlow is this idea of collaboration and integration across that entire supply chain. So there's great companies and technology solutions that are helping that very, very early stage of quantifying the carbon that goes into sourcing materials, but also electrifying and decarbonizing that process. But as a contractor during the construction phase, you can't influence that all that much. That's way, way before you come in. But what you can do is you can produce the demand for those materials. And you can make a purchasing choice to say, I'm going to procure this type of concrete that is lower carbon, and I'm going to keep asking the industry to supply low carbon concrete to me. And that will help them invest in producing lower carbon concrete or recycled and reclaimed steel or responsibly sourced timber. And we've seen this work really well. You know, back 10 years ago, low carbon concrete wasn't really a thing. There were a few people playing with it at the fringes, but there was not mass market supply of this. Today, sat here in Boston, I'm very close to the Sublime guys who are producing low carbon concrete. They're working in partnership with Holcim, who are one of the biggest concrete manufacturers and producers in the globe. They've just worked on a big Boston University building that used all this low carbon concrete. There is huge demand coming from the industry and from clients saying, no, we want to build low carbon. There is now a demand signal for the manufacturers to go and produce it. And there's amazing companies that are coming together to service that demand and enable low carbon construction. So we absolutely can do it, but it's not for one person to do. Many people have to come together to make it work.
Got it. And you mentioned about QFlow and how there's a lot of parties involved with it. So I'm curious to understand, where does QFlow come into the picture, and if you could walk me through the workflow of what needs to happen first and what's the end outcome.
Yeah. So, one of the biggest challenges for the industry is being able to track and measure what's actually going on. And the reason this is so problematic is that it's that old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. Now, when I was a civil engineer, I spent a lot of time trying to design and optimize systems to be more sustainable. I'd then release them to the construction team and I'd say, go do the amazing things. I hope it works out. But I'd never be able to close that loop between construction and design to say, did all of my efforts actually result in a better building? I don't know. And I'd never hear that. And so it was really hard for me to improve and make things more buildable, more sustainable, more efficient because I didn't have that information. So what QFlow is doing is it's helping to capture all that data around what's actually going on during construction. And that feeds back all the way through to those early stages in terms of informing, are we procuring the right materials? When we specify something, is that actually what comes onto site? And did that make us more sustainable or less sustainable? Because did it generate more waste because we're not used to working with that material? So QFlow is capturing all the data about what materials come onto the project, where have they come from in terms of distance, in terms of manufacturer, in terms of trade contractor that's received them. And then we're using that data to help inform the construction team around, firstly, what is their real-time impact? So how are we doing today? But also, how can we do better in the future? How can we use that information to make sure that we are enacting sustainable practices on site? So that's really where QFlow comes into this big piece of the puzzle, is it's providing that foundational data and information that's required to not only make us more efficient and more cost effective on site today, because material wastage is one of the biggest industry problems and there's so many hideous statistics around that we could go into, but it's not just about that bottom line efficiency today, it's also about how can we drive better performance in the future and really drive the industry towards this more sustainable low carbon operational practices.
Awesome. I got a follow up question on this. So the first one is, how do you input all of this information to the software? And B, like, how is this real-time data tracking helping you make better decisions? If you could give me some examples of actionable items done by the general contractors perspective, and also from like an owner or developer's perspective.
Cool. Okay, so how does the data get in the system? Can you take a selfie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most people can. That's pretty much how QFlow captures data. So they take a photograph of the receipt that comes
Mm-hmm.
on with the materials. So in the UK, it's called a good receive note. Here in the US, it's called a bill of ladings. But ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
it's a receipt that says, this is what the material is, how much of it, where it's come from, which supplier. What we then do is we use a load of AI to pull the information out of that image and structure it
Mm-hmm.
into a database, which we audit, we enrich, we clean, and then we notify the construction teams if anything is wrong or missing. Now, the reason I bring up the selfie thing is because when I was working in construction, and my co-founder as well, Jade, used to work for Skanska, we saw so much technology fall flat on its face because it was too complicated. And as an industry, despite the best intentions, we're not the most tech literate. We have a highly transient workforce that often use multiple different languages. And so we had to develop a way of capturing this data that could be done by anyone, even a 5-year-old, anyone who could handle taking a selfie. That was our tech literacy threshold, is can you take a selfie? And that's really worked incredibly well for us because it means that we can onboard project teams in a matter of minutes, let alone weeks. We can get anyone to use the system. So if you've got, staff turnover being quite high, it doesn't matter. They can just pick up the phone, take the photograph, and they've done their job of capturing the data. We then use the sort of AI to do the heavy lifting and the complicated bit, and feeding back those important nuggets of information to the project teams, so the job site guys, who are actually using that to drive decision making. So to the second part of your question around what kind of information are we feeding back and how is that driving changes in process? So because QFlow is kind of like a system of record for all materials that have come onto the site, it can be used by multiple different teams.
Mm-hmm.
So it's firstly used by the finance team. Now, what they're doing is they are taking the data from QFlow and they're comparing it against the invoices that they've received. So they get an invoice from a trade saying, I've done this amount of work, I've used this amount of materials, please pay me. They then say, okay, well, where's the evidence that they've had this much plasterboard or
Mm-hmm.
drywall on site? They can then evidence that within QFlow and say, yep, we're releasing that invoice. So that's how QFlow is being used by finance, is to get really, really quick, but really easily searchable data around what's actually happening on site without them having to go down there, speak to the super, speak to the site
Mm-hmm.
foreman and go, guys, what's actually happening? So, and that's where we've been able to very quickly make sure that construction teams are able to pay their supply chain on time without causing a lot of friction, but also using it for change control and some of the things that go on there. So there's a bit of transparency and accountability happening. The second thing is quality control. So we've got some really nice examples of where this has happened. Basically checking, is it the right material and have we got the right amount of it on the project? So the first example we had was this project we were working on had some very specific requirements around steel and where that steel had come from as well. In using QFlow, they were able to identify that there had been a substitution. So they'd ordered some materials, and the steel that had come onto site didn't meet the threshold that they needed for the project and to meet the client's requirements. So they were able to have a conversation with the subcontractor and say, guys, I'm sorry, you can't use this. You need to go back and actually get the right stuff on the project. Over time, they found that subcontractor in particular was not managing quality properly. Within their material supply chain, they actually stopped working with that subcontractor in the end. We've seen the opposite as well, where they've picked up a risk around timber. They've been able to have the conversation with the trade, the subcontractor, and say, guys, this project definitely needs FSC certified timber. You can't bring unsustainable timber onto site. That subcontractor's gone, okay, my bad. Yep, we had substitutions. We're going to tighten in on this. And then they've persistently been able to deliver to that standard. And so they've had a really good relationship with that subcontractor moving forward. And they've been able to meet the project's requirements without having to do lots of rework. And that was a really expensive problem for that site. So that was a huge win. The final one is around sustainability. Now, this is like a growing area of interest for the industry, particularly in that sort of whole life carbon calculator that we talked about, an aspect called A4 carbon, which is how far have we transported our materials from and how much carbon has been emitted in terms of moving that material from the warehouse to my project. And that's what A4 carbon is. So in QFlow, because we know the dispatch address of those materials and we know the site address that they've come to, we can immediately calculate A4 carbon and we can plot that on a map. So we had a project here in Washington in the States, Washington, DC, sorry, I should say, there's two Washingtons. And when the project manager looked at the portal, he saw that they had deliveries coming from Dallas, Texas. And he was like, hang on a minute, we weren't expecting stuff from Texas on this project. I don't remember seeing that in the submittals. What's going on here? And so they were able to hone in on that specific delivery and realize that it was windows, and that from the submittals, they were expecting those windows to come from a manufacturer in Boston. And so they very quickly had a conversation with the trade who had received them and said, guys, are these the right windows? What's going on? Please don't install the wrong windows. That's incredibly expensive. But actually it turned out that the spec of the windows were fine, but they'd been road freighted from a huge distance away. And so there was a massive carbon footprint associated with having to supply source materials from a completely different state. So what they were able to do with that trade was say, guys, I get it that, you may have saved a couple of quid sourcing it from Texas, but that's not what the client wants on this project. They have specific carbon requirements, so you do need to be using the supplier in Boston. And so it was a very focused, real-time conversation saying, this is a priority for this client. We do need to be managing this, and I appreciate your efforts, but in this instance, we're saying, no, we want it from Boston. And so they were able to, in real time, reduce their carbon footprint on that project because they were managing the location of that supply chain.
Interesting. Those are, I kind of liked all these use cases and I want to spend some time here. Have you heard about material passports? I was actually in one of the networking events and I met a gentleman from the UK, and he worked in this space, and it was quite interesting to see how it could be used for what you guys are doing right now. I mean, all that information, if it's tagged, I guess it makes your job easier on your end, just having all the information readily available to track it, right?
Yeah, so material passports is part of the puzzle to try and unlock the circular economy for the built environment. And this is my absolute passion project. It's very dangerous getting me on the topic of circularity because we will end up talking for hours. The one nugget that keeps coming up is I recently I bought a house a few years back, and the kitchen had really bad water damage, so I had to replace the kitchen. It was from the 80s as well, so it was pretty destroyed. And I decided I was going to source everything from the circular economy. So everything came from Gumtree, Facebook Marketplace, FreeCycle, and it was a really fun project. I had to be super patient to find the right materials, but I was able to build a kitchen almost entirely from the circular economy, almost. But in the process, saved myself £6,500. So huge cost saving by doing it this way. So this is a huge opportunity for the built environment as well. The problem is doing it on a tiny scale in terms of my kitchen at home is great. I'm the client. I can be patient. I can say what qualities I'm happy to sort of compromise on. When you're doing this at scale in the built environment, it becomes a lot more complicated, which is why material passports become really, really important. So a material passport will tell you not only the spec of the material, but also how long it's been in play, where did it come from, does it have any volatile organic compounds in it, what might be the residual value of that material. So it's this kind of information that's going to be required if we're going to start being able to reclaim and reuse materials in construction. So what we're doing at QFlow around material passports is because we're tracking materials as they go into a building, and we know where they came from, when they were installed, what standards they met at the time, we've got the beginnings of a material passport. What we want to be able to do is push that data into these material reuse platforms, and there's sort of loads popping up around the industry at the moment, so that architects and designers can start specifying reclaimed materials, because you know when they're going to come back online, because you're deconstructing a building, what standards they met, so the client can be confident in the quality and that they are going to be of the right spec for them.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can send them back to the material manufacturer. And this is where I think it's going to really take off, is when we have the original material manufacturers developing new business models that mean that they will have a take back scheme. And we see this in the UK at the moment. There's a great company that does it with carpet tiles and suspended ceilings. There's another one that we know that does it with lighting, and they'll take back lighting systems, they'll remanufacture them, clean them up, and then sell them back to you. So this is where I think it's going to get super, super unlocked. But it does require those material passports to make that possible, so that you know which manufacturer they need to go back to, and or what standards that they meet today, so that you can reuse them with confidence and not be worried about being sued later down the line or things breaking and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when I was talking with him as well, this kind of space seemed very interesting, but I felt like there's a lot to do there currently with the current state of things, and I mean we're slowly progressing, but I feel like it's gonna take some time. Um,
It's definitely going to take time because there's so many people involved. But I think what's so exciting is that people are starting to talk about it. I was at Climate Week in New York a few weeks back, and we went to a brilliant panel hosted by Saint-Gobain on this. And obviously, they're a huge material manufacturer. So the big players are starting to think about it and talk about it, which is incredibly encouraging. And also, all of the information that we're being made to collect today around quality control and carbon reporting are the information that we need for materials management in the future and for unlocking that circular economy. So if we're capturing that foundational data today, we've got the potential and the opportunity to unlock the circular economy in the future. But it will take some time. There's lots of moving parts, lots of people involved, but the right people are thinking about it, which is super exciting.
Yeah, I also want to touch upon. So we talked about collecting information. How does all of it tie to like the building certifications like LEED? I remember I worked on one of the LEED projects, and specifically for like the waste tickets, it just takes ample amount of time to track all of it, make sure that's accurate, and you need to also report it. So, how does QFlow or any other information tracking systems help with this effort?
Yeah, so in the UK, we track waste in exactly the same way. So every waste movement that goes off on a construction site has to have a waste transfer note. That's a legal document. It includes the 9 points of duty of care. So it will be what type of waste it is, who's moving it, what their license is, where they're taking it, all of those different bits. So we, in the same way, take a photograph of that, we digitize it, we audit it, so we check that it meets the legal requirements, and we use that to analyze where's that waste going, how much of it has been diverted from landfill, how is it being processed, what's the carbon emissions associated with that. And that's really straightforward. And we've been doing that at scale for the last 6 years. In the US, however, it's slightly more complicated. And it's actually something we're unpicking right now, because waste management in the States varies city by city, let alone state by state. The depth of information that's provided to construction teams does seem to vary a lot. So if they're going for LEED, as you said, they get much better data.
Mhm.
But it's, as I understand it, it's quite an effort to try and get it out of the waste
Yeah.
carriers.
Yes.
Whereas if they're not going for LEED, a lot of sites aren't even asking for it. So it's something we're still trying to figure out how we can help the industry with. And if anyone wants to talk to us about it, I'm all ears, trying to understand wastage in construction. But the one thing that we really do hope to help to drive, regardless of waste tracking, is reducing material wastage in the first place. So there's this horrible statistic from UKGBC, which has been quoted all over the place, and that's the UK Green Building Council,
Mhm.
for anyone who's not familiar, that 13% of all materials that go onto a construction site go direct to waste without even being used. So it's not that they were used
Wow.
and damaged, it was just that they were overordered, they got damaged in the weather, they just got lost or like we're in the wrong place. And we see this all the time. And we
Yeah.
have this huge issue in the industry with materials management. And then the easiest thing to do with it is just dip it in landfill. And it's just mind boggling because 40% of a project's budget is spent on materials.
Right.
You're literally throwing away money and it costs to
Yeah.
move that waste. And it's just like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So by getting better control and transparency over the materials that are coming onto site, we should be able to then reduce the amount of wastage we're generating in the first place, and therefore obviously save a huge amount of time and money, and also reduce our carbon and environmental footprint. So that's a
Right.
fun thing that we're unpicking at the moment. But yes, the
Yeah.
industry terrifies me with its waste management.
Yeah. So you've talked about cost. So let's spend some time about cost. With any new technology, I always like to ask is, and there's a pre-notion, especially about sustainable projects, that hey, sustainable materials cost more money. There's more investment needed. So with the technology side of things, first question is how do you kind of justify the return on investment for this? And second question is that pre-notion correct?
Mm. So when it comes to QFlow and softwares to help manage this, any technology has to provide a return on investment for the construction company using it. Otherwise, it's just not going to get procured. We're not. I know there are lots of great passionate people in this industry, but we don't buy stuff if it doesn't make us more money. That's just like the way the industry works. And the way that we sort of justify the cost of QFlow is very much directly within time saving. We currently have people on sites, trained engineers who are basically chasing bits of paper around. It's insane. QFlow just automates all of that. It automates all the typing up, the auditing, the chasing. Like, there's a huge time saving there, and it also makes your project team less stressed and, quite frankly, wound up. Um, there's also the reduced risk. And coming back to some of those use cases I mentioned earlier, the project that was trying to track and manage timber in particular, they were finding that they were installing uncertified timber into this project. They were being inspected and audited, and then they were having to rip it out. So they were spending more money on replacing those materials, disposing of that waste, redoing the work, all the labor, and they were delaying their program. So the
Right.
compounding cost of using the wrong materials and having the wrong materials on site was astronomical. It was hundreds of thousands of pounds. So there are some really nice easy use cases where you prevent one wrong thing happening, you're immediately paying back the value of the system. So that's why I think a lot of the software tools, particularly those that are doing sort of computer vision and snagging and
Mm-hmm.
quality control, that's why it's very straightforward to show that they do
Mm-hmm.
return investment very quickly. In terms of the materials, like sustainable materials, and this perception that they are more expensive, I think it's in where they're in their nascency, it can be true. They are more costly upfront.
Mm-hmm.
That's often because of the scale of production. But we saw this with solar voltaics. Solar panels, photovoltaic cells, they were very expensive to start with. The cost of PV has dropped dramatically to the point that it is now cheaper to install PV than it is to buy gas over time. So the cost of these sustainable solutions is now dramatically less than the unsustainable solutions. And this is what we're starting to see with sustainable materials in the construction industry. It's in part just a matter of time and persistent investment in those materials. So low carbon concrete is a great example where it's now getting to a point of cost parity, if not often outperforming some of these things. We'll see the same for sort of low carbon insulations, paints, all of those things. It is just a bit of a matter of time. But the more the industry drives demand, the more investment will go into these, and therefore the cost will come down. And it's just that sort of whole capitalist free market model, which, is questionable at times, but it will help to improve the accessibility and the financial viability of these materials.
I think you mentioned a great point about it's just a timing function and you need to be like persistent about it. I read a stat about the value of the property increases like 7 to 8% if you use sustainable materials over the course of project. So the question is, how how does like developers or owners try to leverage this value and try to balance it out with like the immediate financial restraints versus long-term benefits?
Yeah, and this, I mean, again, one of my favorite topics is like the economics behind sustainability. So the stats that I've had on this, in London, you can charge a 12% rent premium if you have a sustainable building. And that is why a lot of our clients like Landsec, GPE, Grosvenor, they go for these sustainability targets, not just BREEAM or LEED. Like it's not good enough to be like BREEAM Excellent or like LEED Platinum anymore, because a lot of buildings are doing that. They're now stacking them. They're going for like net zero carbon, low VOC, well standard, all of these ones, because they can charge the rent premium. And we, like as a technology company, we will only inhabit buildings that have these sustainability certificates. We will pay that rent premium. So there is a real demand for it. In New York Climate Week, one of the statistics that kept coming up was that there's something like I think it was like a 60% demand supply deficit. So there is 60% more demand for sustainable buildings than the market can supply. So people are just not able to get into them. So I can't remember which of the architect firms was talking about this. They were saying like there are more people wanting sustainable spaces than the market can provide them, and so that premium is going up even further. But there's also people who are getting kind of wound up by it and are therefore moving as a result. And so there really is an economic benefit to, in the long term, to the clients and the developers that are willing to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Where our industry falls on its face is the way that we do build and sell. And so the investment in building those buildings in the right way with that long-term operational benefit, that long-term health and well-being and sustainability benefit doesn't get carried through to those clients moving forward, because we were just building it as cheap as we can and churning it out.
Right.
And so it's where you've got these design, build, operate, or the sort of like build and hold. So where you're working with higher education, so universities and colleges,
Mm-hmm.
they are owning that asset. They will pay more to make sure that it operates efficiently, that it's a safe and well space, and that it meets the sort of sustainability aspirations of their students. And we work on a couple of university sites here in the US. Specifically for that reason. They will invest in that long-term value. On the flip side, we work with some residential developers, and the ones that we don't work with is because they're like, nope, we churn them out as cheap as we can, and then we sell them on, and we don't think about it. So while the industry has this very transactional short-term view, they're going to struggle to justify investing in sustainability because all they want to do is flip it and run. Where they're holding that asset for longer, or where they can see that they can sell it for a premium, that's where that's starting to change. And the final thing I wanted to leave you with there is that I was at a brilliant conference at the end of sometime earlier. I think it was either early this year or end of last year, where Noe Group were talking about stranded assets, and where they are, where you've got these real estate owners who hold lots of buildings, where legislation is saying you can't have a building that performs at a lower energy rating. So let's say energy rating E, they can no longer sell them. So they're literally holding a dead asset. They can't tenant them, they can't sell them because no one wants it. So they are having to invest in stripping out these buildings and making them more efficient and more sustainable, because otherwise they just physically can't liquidate them. And so this is what I think we're starting to see more and more of, is the real estate owners going, well, now we are definitely losing money because we are not able to meet those sustainability targets. And the stranded assets thing, I think, is going to, particularly in Europe, is playing out pretty compellingly. In the US, I'm not so sure how far we've got with that yet. We'll see over the next few years as to how compelling that would be. But there's definitely a much stronger demand for sustainable assets than the market can supply right now.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. And I think the economic benefits also kind of tie into the regulations and the policies kind of pushing it. Specifically in the EU or UK, have you seen any recent regulations that have been beneficial to push the decarbonization in construction industry?
Yes, not as much as we'd like, but what we are seeing, and there's more coming, but what we are seeing is that you have these pioneering or sort of leading developers like Landsec and Grosvenor and that lot, who set the bar. So they say, look, we're going to build to these net zero standards, or we're going to build to these responsible standards. And they show that it's possible. And they also show that it's cost effective to do. They are then trying to push the government to legislate to that standard. So in the UK, there's a piece of legislation that's been in and out of Parliament recently, which is called Part Z. It's an amendment to our Buildings Act, which follows Part L. So Part L said you've got to deliver operationally sustainable buildings to a certain standard. Part Z says you've got to deliver embodied carbon sustainable
Oh,
buildings to a certain standard. And it's really interesting because the way it's been written is to say the first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure it. So and the way it was written so that it would kick in 2025, whether that happens or not, it's up for debate. But it said, from 2025 onwards, you've got to measure your whole life carbon for every development over, I think it was 8,000 square feet, or
wow.
10 dwellings. They said everything over that size, you have to measure your whole life carbon. Then by 2027, you have to show that you are beating this threshold. You have to have a lower embodied carbon than this threshold. And then by 2029, it will go down again. And so they will have to get better and better at that whole life carbon piece. And this reflects legislation that we've seen in other parts of Europe as well. And it's similar to some stuff that we've seen proposed in the US. So this whole point around measuring and managing your embodied carbon and then figuring out ways to lower it for large developments is definitely something that's starting to come through. The key thing there, I think, is that the private pioneering entities are the ones who've shown that it's possible and they've kind of set the bar. They're now lobbying the government to bring up the laggards with the rest of the legislation. And where they've been successful is that the GLA, which is the Greater London Authority, which is the planning body in London, has adopted this. So if you are developing in London, you have to measure your whole life carbon over a certain size and you have to start showing reductions. The next step is to try and expand that across the whole of the UK, and eventually I'm sure we'll see it more globally. In lead version 5, which is meant to come out sometime next year, take some impact next year, there is a requirement for measuring whole life carbon and eventually for showing some kind of reduction. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like because it's still out for that final public comment, but the measurement and management of whole life carbon, embodied carbon, will come through in lead. And that will be a minimum requirement. So lead version 5 will be a really interesting first step on that front for the US as well.
Yeah, and I think UK and EU have been front leaders in terms of sustainability, but especially in the other countries, there's been this concept of carbon offsetting. I don't know if it's been used much in the construction space, but I wanted to know what are your views on it. I personally think it's just a short term, just a fix and not really a long term sustainable effort. But I'm curious to know what's your view on that.
Yeah, it's such a Marmite thing, and I've heard some really great arguments on both sides of this, and I don't think it's binary. I think the ability to use carbon offsetting is quite important for us on the journey, but it is not the solution. And anyone who is claiming to be net zero by just paying for loads of offsets is just greenwashing, and it's not good enough. I think the way that the SBTI has set out their expectations around this is quite nice and clear. They've said
What's
if you're signing
SPTI?
up to the science-based targets, so yeah, if you've gone for the science-based targets initiative and you've signed up to that, what they say is that you have to achieve a 90% reduction in your embodied carbon, in your carbon emissions, and then you can offset the final 10% that you haven't been able to eliminate. And
Oh, okay.
it's a tough expectation, particularly for construction. I think
Yeah.
90% is going to be really hard for construction to achieve. And I'm always interested when I hear that big construction companies have signed up to it. I'm like, oh, okay. But it's a great aspiration, and I think it's a pragmatic initial starting point to say you can't just offset 100%.
Right.
We want 90% to be dealt with through reduction and elimination, and then that last 10% that you just really can't get rid of, fine, you can offset that.
Hmm.
So they have a role to play, same as carbon capture and storage, which is again real Marmite subject. I am very, very much on the fence about it. it has a role to play, but it cannot be the solution. And again, I think it's the real risk of leveraging carbon capture and storage is that the big carbon emitters use that as a don't worry, we can keep extracting it from the ground and pumping it into the atmosphere because we'll just pull it back out again. That is not going to work. We need to stop putting it in the atmosphere. And we need to be using carbon capture and storage to reduce the amount that's in the atmosphere now, not the stuff that you're about to put in. But that's my personal opinion on it. So again, carbon capture and storage has a role to play, but it is not the solution. And please do not lean on it that way.
And what's your views on the carbon taxes and some of those stricter requirements to kind of push this, or like what's your take on that one?
These are good questions. Um, the reality is that we, as a society, we operate within a capitalist model that anchors everything to pretty much the US dollar, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're gonna be able to quantify the impact in a way that people understand and that can be traded in the capitalist market, there is going to have to be some kind of monetization of carbon. I don't like it. I would much rather we found a better way of doing it. I love the donut economics model. If anyone's read that book, I think it's a really good way of breaking it down. And it presents this challenge of degrowth. And actually, do we need to be honest with ourselves about, GDP, like gross domestic production, and showing constant growth? That's not necessarily the way to go, and we probably should rethink that. But while we are operating within a capitalist model that requires trading of this stuff, I think carbon taxes and a certain amount of carbon trading is going to be required just to enable us to rationalize this against our capital markets. I don't like it. I would like to see a much better way of doing it, and I think there have been some great proposals around better ways of doing it, but I appreciate that it's the system that we're in right now.
Right. Last question on this regulation part. Uh, if you had an option, like what would be one regulation that you would like to see that would help push decarbonization?
I think it would be the implementation of Part Z. So a blanket commitment that people firstly need to measure and reduce their whole life carbon. And the reason I think whole life carbon works as a model for now, it's not perfect because it completely ignores modern slavery, environmental degradation, like all the other aspects. But what it does do is it's a very clean, simple, quite broad way of measuring the impact of something that goes right back to the source. So it's not just operational, it's just that's far too limiting. We do need to go back to accounting for the impact of what we do right back to the point at which we take it out the ground. And I think it's a pragmatic way of doing it to say first you got to measure, then you can reduce. But without measuring, we're making, so many companies are making these SBTI commitments without even knowing what their carbon footprint is. And we saw this in 2021 in the UK with a lot of big construction companies coming out being like, oh, we're net zero already, and everyone was like, no, you're not. What are you talking about? It just opens up to this obscene greenwashing, but also just blind shooting into the dark, trying to reduce carbon by electrifying fleets and things like that, which are important steps, but they are not going to deal with 90% of the problem. But if you can't even measure the 90% of the problem, how the hell are you meant to improve it? So that would be my one bit of regulation: is measure it, figure out what you're doing, and then you can figure out how to reduce it.
Yeah, like perfectly said. If you don't measure it, you don't know what you're going after. So yeah. So switching subjects, I want to take you back in early days of QFlow. You started back in 2018. Just wanted to ask, what are some of the changes you've seen from 2018 to now 2024 in terms of industry mindset, and then also your personal learnings throughout this entire journey?
Yeah, it has been massive. Like the change is huge. So when we founded the company in 2018, sustainability was a passion project of the few. And our first client, Canary Wharf, they were one of the few that were really trying to publicly push to be more sustainable and more responsible. And for them, it was, they were specifically looking at FSC certified timber. It was a time where we were talking, in the media, we had images of orangutans losing their homes due to deforestation, and it was a very emotive subject. But that really was the niche within which the industry was thinking about sustainability. It was timber sourcing. From there, we had in the UK, we had 2019, our then Prime Minister Theresa May enshrined in law that the UK had to be net zero by 2050. And she just kind of like mic dropped and ran, because like at that point she left being prime minister and she'd like managed to just cram this into being a legal commitment. And I massively respect her for being able to do that. And it was one of the best things that I think she did was, set that bar. But she then obviously wasn't able to hang around and implement it. So it took the industry a year to figure out that meant them. And then in 2020, we had this mass declaration of climate emergency. The construction industry is part of it. We're all going to be net zero by some date into the far future. And that's where we saw some of these slightly interesting declarations of we're net zero already, or Skanska coming out and saying we'll be net zero by 2045 and here's how we're going to do it. And they did a really good job on it. And I think Skanska really set that bar up front, saying we're not just talking about scope 1 and 2, we're talking scope 3. And scope 3, that's 95% of our problem. And for those who aren't familiar, scope 3 means your extended supply chain. So it's not just the energy and the fuel you burn, it's everything that supplies you. So the materials, their transport emissions, everything that goes on. And so that, I think, was a real turning point for the industry. It wasn't just a hypothetical conversation. It wasn't just a green tick box exercise or greenwashing. It was, how are you actually going to do this? Because by 2050, legally within the UK, you are required to show you are net zero. And that started this interesting snowball of companies suddenly realizing you can't manage what you can't measure. So if they have to be net zero, where are they today? Like, where are they emitting? What do those emissions look like? Who are their biggest emitters? So who within their supply chain do they need to be working with first? If their supply chain is 95% of their emissions, which ones do they need to be helping to shift? Otherwise, they've got no chance. And so that was where we saw the sort of the tipping point for the UK. We then started spending a lot more time in the States as well. And we were just reflecting on this morning, that when we came to Greenbuild, which is a conference that we're going to next week, we came to Greenbuild when it was in Washington, DC, and all of the conversation was around scope 1 and 2. Not a lot talking about scope 3 carbon. It was like, we're going to electrify our buildings and we're going to try and get off the gas grid. And we were like, okay. We then came back 3 months later. We came back to New York Build, and all of a sudden there was all of these conversations around scope 3 carbon. And like, we're like, where has this come from? Like, all of a sudden people are talking about scope 3. They've suddenly like got to this point where they're like, no, it's our supply chain. We've got to work with the supply chain. How do we deal with this? And then take it forward a few more months, we came to New York Build, and everyone was came to New York Climate Week, and everyone was talking about circularity. And the pace of progress here in the States is just rapid. And there are still so many people who aren't having the conversation, but the front end of that curve is moving quicker than it moved in the UK and Europe, which is great. It means we're learning from the mistakes of others, and we're able to accelerate it here in the US. So I think from when we founded QFlow, it was like, this is going to be such a big uphill battle, and if we can get one company to change, that's a win. Now it's like, I'm not just fixing the UK. Let's go work with the US, and let's work with Australia, and like we can do this. We can get the whole industry working more sustainably. We can move them to a circular economy, and the momentum is massively behind us. And it's not just us doing it. There are these amazing companies springing up left, right, and center, helping this industry do this in a way that is cost effective and like beneficial, and driving efficiency as well as driving sustainability. So it's super, super exciting, and just worlds away from where it was in 2018.
Awesome. I think this was great. Before we go to our rapid fire, any final thoughts?
No, just thanks so much for having us on. And I think, just to reiterate that last point, I'm so optimistic about where we're at with construction and with decarbonisation. the whole world has moved on from straws up turtles' noses, which is still a big problem. Like, we do need to deal with plastic pollution, but we're now thinking about the huge scale systemic shifts in industries that we need to achieve to really be able to decarbonize. And construction has got away for a really long time of being like the fringes, not really looked at, it's not really in the public eye, it's a bit of a black box. No, the eye is on us now, and people are aware that we are 40% of that problem. And so we do need to step up, but people are stepping up, which is great.
Yep. So awesome. Moving to the rapid fire. I got some spicy questions for you there, Brittany.
Oh, okay.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is easy one. What's a book recommendation?
I've got so many. Okay, two. One on circular economy, donut economics. It's brilliant. It's just a new way of thinking about the world and capitalism and consumption. I think it's great. My second one is Surrounded by Idiots, and that is all about people and the way that people love to communicate. And for me, it's just completely transformed the way that I work with the team and humans, and I loved it. So Surrounded by Idiots, it's a great book.
Interesting. Second question, what's your favorite green building or sustainable project that you've come across?
Oh, I'm not allowed to say my kitchen, am I? I don't know. There've been some great ones. I think one that we've been working on recently in London is called TBC London by Four Partnership. And they've done a huge amount around trying to reuse materials. And I loved chatting to one of the guys on the project, a guy called Basil Demetrius, who is very enthusiastically was telling me how they took the steel beams from Selfridges. And I was thinking as he described it, I was like, did they know you were doing that? I was just imagining him like creeping in with a crane and ripping their steel beams out. But no, they had this amazing agreement where they were taking big steel beams from a site on one side of London and moving it to be used as an element in this new building. And I just think as a demonstration of how the circular economy can work, that was a really good one.
Yeah, I think for me it would be the Candida building here in Atlanta. They actually completed the Living Building Challenge.
Oh,
So
great.
yeah, so I got to tour that. It's built by Skanska, so I got to tour that place. It's awesome, like how each and everything is thought out. Again, the importance of mass timber there. It's a beautiful project.
Well, next time I'm in Atlanta, I'm gonna have to go check that out.
Yep, absolutely. Next one I have is a sustainability. I got to repeat that. A sustainability buzzword that is being overused.
Oh, there's so many. I think it's not a buzzword, but it's being talked about a lot, which is EPDs. It's
EPDs.
environmental product declarations.
Mhm.
It's kind of like the recipe for materials, but it's a hot topic right now. And I think that's in part because the iMasons Accord came out with their, letter to the industry saying, guys, we need more EPDs to know what's
Right.
going into these materials. Come on, start producing them. I think it's something that's going around a lot in the industry. There's a really big focus on it right now, but it's a necessary focus. So I wouldn't say it's a bad buzzword. It's an important buzzword to know.
Yeah, I think I came across that word during the lead certification. Like you are tracking EPDs through all the submittals and everything. So cool. One thing everyone in the construction industry should know about decarbonization.
It's very doable and it can save you money. And I had a lovely conversation this morning with a big contractor here in Boston where the sustainability team were a bit stressed out because they were like, we've signed up to SBTIs, we don't know what we're doing, like this, we've got to do something, but we have no budget. We have no budget to do this sustainability stuff. How do we make this work? But all the data that we capture in QFlow is also used by finance and quality. So we were like,
Right.
give it to your finance and quality team to buy. And the great thing is it's saving them time. So we have a case study from when we were working with Bouygues Construction, big French contractor. They do a lot down here in Florida. And they were using it in the UK for basically doing that invoice verification. And their finance team said it improved their efficiency by 270%.
Wow.
I was just like,
that's huge.
What? So it was saving them an obscene amount of time and money, and therefore the sustainability team were able to get the data they needed. So yeah, don't panic. It doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. It can actually make your life a hell of a lot easier and be like financially beneficial.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brittany. I think this was informative personally for me. I got to learn a lot from this. So thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me. And if anyone's got further questions, I know decarbonisation looks scary and complicated, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm more than willing to answer questions. So find me on LinkedIn, and I will do my best to help, because we've got to all do this together. It's not a one point of solution. It's everyone pulling in the same direction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Thank you for tuning in to Constructing Tomorrow. I hope this episode provided valuable insights and tips. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop a review or a comment. Until next time, keep building and stay curious.